from the beginning. What was it like growing up and spending time outside of the United States, and particularly in Iran?
Well, I was born in Iran, and everybody always says, well, why on earth were you born in Iran? And other than the fact that my parents were there, which is the obvious reason, the story is a little complicated, but I guess it boils down to this. My father, who was a physician, and after finishing his residency, joined the Army, and after a couple years in the Army, he was looking for a job at a major academic teaching institution in the United States. He wanted to do research in his specialty of pathology and genetics. And he could not find a job comparable to his white counterparts. And so he and my mom, who are, let's say, very interested in doing things outside their comfort zone, decided to look for job opportunities outside the United States. And my father landed a job offer at the NYSE hospital, which was a brand new hospital, hadn't even opened up yet, in Shiraz, Iran, chairing the Department of Pathology. So a job that was not available to him in his own country. And so he and my mom picked up and went halfway across the world, and I was the second baby born in the NYSE hospital. They practiced on some other baby first. I can't tell you how that went, but it went okay with me, and we lived there until I was 5. And from there, my father started doing research in Iran, and it caught the attention of some folks at the Galton Labs at University College of London. And my parents were beginning to think it was time to start going back home. My mom was homesick for her family, and I think they both missed the United States. And they thought, well, why not take advantage of this job offer to go to the Galton Labs for a year? So off he went there. And from there, he started doing research again, and his research got the attention at some international conference of the dean of the University of Chicago Medical Center. And so he landed a tenured track position in my mother's hometown in the same neighborhood where my grandmother and her other daughter and our whole extended family lived. And my father used to always say to me growing up that sometimes the shortest distance to where you really want to go means you better be prepared to take the long way around. And they sure did take that long way around. And that's where we lived. But for me, coming to the United States was like going to a foreign country. And I was already kind of shaken up going to London. And then here, my parents are so excited about going back home, but it wasn't familiar to me. And thank goodness I have this large extended family that you know so well, yes, that made me, in short order, feel like it was home. But I will say this, and I say this to people who have, at some point in their life, felt like the other, the only, that when I was plopped down in this public school in my neighborhood, and I had a British accent, it only takes 1 year to develop a British accent, and I'm speaking Farsi, French, and English, and I got red hair and freckles and light skin, and I was 2 years ahead of myself in school. Well, I used to get beat up every day, every single day, for any one of those reasons. And so what did I do? I stopped speaking Farsi. I lost that British accent the first week. And I stopped telling my story about being born in Iran. And the first, I would say, 20 plus years of my life, no one had heard of Iran. And then after President Carter went through the hostage crisis, everyone had heard of Iran. And it kind of went downhill from there to today. And so for a long time, I just shied away from a very important part of who I was. And I learned a lot about the United States, living in an underdeveloped country where we didn't have the advantages we have here in terms of either clean food and water, let alone civil liberties. And also I just felt that it gave me a perspective on the world that sometimes when you only know the United States, you think it's the greatest country already on earth, but it's not the only country on earth. We can learn a great deal outside of our shores. And so those lessons that I learned were really important lessons, and I never talked about them.
This is true. And then you finally...
I opened up. I started opening up and kind of owning my story.
Right.
And part of why my book is called Finding My Voice is I think oftentimes we don't listen to the quiet voice inside of us and don't trust it, and it's actually the most important one. But we also don't use our voice to share our story, because when we do that, people discover who we are. In my book, I have the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. Because without it, you wouldn't really know who I am.
Another point that I thought was really interesting is that your parents took the risk to go outside of the country for opportunities.
Yes.
You had all of the opportunities and took the risk to take a different one. So take us back to that special moment in your office where you're arguably at the peak of your career. You go to these phenomenal schools. You're in this career, a legal career, you're being recognized, you're doing well, and you say, this isn't it. So take us to that point where you first heard that voice that encouraged you to take a risk.
So I begin my book with the story of sitting on the 79th floor of what was then called the Sears Tower in Chicago. It was the tallest building in our city, magnificent views of Lake Michigan, and I would turn my back to the door, and I would close the door, and I'd look out the window, and I would just cry. And the reason why I was crying is that when I was in college 10 years earlier, I had come up with a 10-year plan. And it went, I don't know how many of you came up with plans coming out of school,
yes,
but
definitely.
I had and I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I felt like everybody else had a plan. I needed a plan too. So my plan went something like this. I was going to go right to law school. I picked law school because, well, I had started out pre-med.
So did I.
And two things happened the same semester. My boyfriend, who was in medical school, took me to his anatomy class. And at the same time, I was taking organic chemistry.
The worst.
Enough said about my medical school path. So then I thought, well, maybe I should go to business school, but there was this really good party the night before the GMATs. I never actually made it to the GMAT exam. I do wish I had gone to business school. That would have come in handy. But my best friend went to law school, and she was 2 years older than I, and she said, go to law school, it'll buy you time, and you'll discover something passionate about the practice of law. So my plan was go right to law school, discover that passion, probably move back home to Chicago, because I'm an only child, and I missed my family, fall in love, get married, and have a baby by 30, thinking about that biological clock. It ticks later now, for those of you who are thinking about that. Don't worry so much about it. They have ways to help. And then live happily ever after, because what more could you want in life than that? So I went right to law school. I moved to Chicago, and I went to a really good, excellent law firm. And I discovered that I was really interested in real estate law, which that firm didn't have. And so I went to an even better law firm. I married, Leon knows this story, figuratively the boy next door, in that our moms grew up in the same apartment building that my grandfather managed. Our fathers were very good friends. Our grandmothers were good friends. He was a doctor. My father was a doctor. I'd had a crush on him since I was 8, and he was 12. In fact, I used to go to church with my grandmother just because he was an altar boy. And he literally never looked at me once until I was 25. And then we were at one of my cousin's weddings, and he came out of the chapel, and he looked right at me, and I thought, I'm going to marry you. That's about how much thought I gave it. And so what could go wrong? Boy next door? Plenty. Enough said.
Quite the planner.
So now I did have my daughter Laura just shy of my 29th birthday. And Laura, almost 4 weeks ago, turned me into the best position of life, which is grandmother.
Yay.
I know. Very excited about that. She's now 33 and will be up here in a couple of weeks. I can hardly wait. So that's the one thing I did do perfectly. But I was in this law firm, and everyone around me thought, oh my gosh, it's so fancy, and you have your own assistant, and you've got, beautiful view of Lake Michigan and a highfalutin clients. What's wrong with you? And I really thought to myself, I should be happy. Everybody tells me I have the perfect life. My friends are envious of me, but I am miserable. And I started listening to the quiet voice inside of me. And some of you will remember Mayor Harold Washington. He was the first African-American mayor of Chicago, and he had just been reelected to his second term in office. And I had knocked on doors for him. He barely knew who I was. The only reason he would have known me was because my father-in-law was a very good friend of his. And I admired him from afar. And with his first election, I started focusing on city government in a way I never had before. And I think it was irrelevant to my life. I didn't feel any affinity to the prior mayors, and I didn't even know how you got basic services, who picked up your garbage, how the snow was removed, how the budget, I knew nothing. I don't think I even knew who my alderman was until he was elected, but in his first term, I started paying attention. And when he was reelected, a very dear friend of mine said, why don't you consider public service? You are so miserable doing what everybody else thinks you should do. Why don't you do something where you'll be a part of something bigger than yourself?
That's powerful.
Where you'll feel a broader purpose in life. And so I walked out of that office in City Hall, and I remember my office in the big law firm. I remember my first day walking into City Hall. For reasons I don't remember, my mother drove me to work, which seems kind of odd. I'm full grown, and I don't know why. She gave me a ride to work, but maybe it was so when she pulled into the front of City Hall, she could say, "I can't believe I paid all that tuition for you to go and work here." Really, she thought I'd lost my mind. And it wasn't honestly until she would admit about 5 years ago, I finally said to her, "Don't you think it was the right move?" And she says, "Well, maybe things worked out all right."
Yeah, they worked very
maybe
well.
so.
Maybe so.
But I was way off course. And I said to my parents, "Look what you did." I'm sure that their families weren't very happy when they went to Iran. I said, "I'm just going down the street to City Hall." But I walked in that first day, Valerie, and I felt I belonged.
That's
and
a great feeling.
I walked into my office, and my boss met me in reception. He said, "Let me take you to your office," but he did air quotes, which is not a good sign when somebody does air quotes. And so I'm like, "What does he mean?" So I go to the bowels of the agency, and there is my cubicle with a window facing an alley. And I did do a little like gut check because I'd taken a cut and pay and all that. And I thought, you know what? This is going to work out.
That's great.
And I never looked back.
That's fantastic. So a lot of people know that you're supposed to listen to the voice, and they sometimes even hear it. But what gave you the courage and
To trust it?
To trust it and to act on it? And what would you tell people? How would you advise those who have the voice but are just deathly afraid of the unknown?
Well, one of the things that motivated me to act on it was I was miserable. So there's nothing like being very miserable. In fact, I often think, well, what if I had been just like a little miserable? Might I have stayed in either the marriage or in the law firm? So I was good and miserable. And I think it was my friend pushing me. And we all need a nudge sometimes. And so, that means you have to open up and tell your friends how you feel and your family how you feel. You can't just pretend like I've got this and everything is perfect if inside of you you're miserable. And that's what they're there for. They're to be a sounding board. And I think ultimately, like, what do you have to lose? Like, say if it hadn't worked out. Right. I probably could go back to a law firm, right?
That's true.
It's not like you can't go back, but you just would never know if you don't take these chances. And so I think one of the lessons that I talk about extensively in my book is that early in my career, I was painfully shy, very quiet, never spoke up in class. And as I said, didn't really have a plan, so I made up a plan. And I craved the comfort of kind of the straight line. And I had to learn to appreciate the magic and the adventure of the zigzag. And I look back over my life now, and it makes perfectly good sense. But at the time, each of these changes I made didn't necessarily make sense. And so in the end, it adds up. And I think, why wouldn't you take a chance from time to time?
That's right.
And we do allow ourselves to stay in either misery or almost worse, mediocrity, right?
Good point. So true.
Don't do that. Have
That's
a
right.
purposeful life. And it doesn't really matter. I mean, you've got to find, everybody's got something different that their voice is telling them is their passion. And it doesn't mean every day is perfect when you follow that passion. I've had some really hard days following my passion. But I do feel like it was purposeful and meaningful to me.
Right. That's beautiful.
When President Obama was in office, this was in the wake of Michael Brown.
Yes.
He convened a group of experts, which included everyone from, you may have seen him on the news, Police Chief Ramsey, who was the second in command in Chicago and then ran the police department in Philadelphia and put into practice in Chicago and Philadelphia community policing. We had academic experts, we had faith leaders, and we had young activists, including a young woman named Brittany Packnett, who was from Ferguson and had worked for Teach for America and began the demonstrations in Ferguson after Michael Brown's death. And we really wanted to develop a template for best practices to give to local law enforcement, because the federal government, all we really had were strings that we could attach to money that we gave local law enforcement, and also technical expertise and funding for example, body cameras. I mean, one of the reasons why we are now seeing so much of what has always existed between black boys and men and police department around our country is because it's being captured on video. Laquan McDonald, his death was captured on video. And so our thought was that one of the many ways to protect good police and make sure that they're being held accountable is body cameras. and the federal government was helping to pay for body cameras. That's one of the recommendations that was in this report. But I think if I were to sum up the most important recommendation, it was community policing. The police have to get out of their cars and into the community, because in so many of our communities, because this bond of trust has been breached, residents will not help the police do their jobs. And they don't trust the system. And let me tell you, now that I know as much as I do about the criminal justice system, the tip of the iceberg is improving the relationship between police and communities of color. There is so much that is inhumane about our current criminal justice system. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's people who are incarcerated. 2.2 plus million people in our country. 600,000 are released every year, but released into what? I mean, are they going to get hired?
Yes.
Do they have the training that they need? No
checking
opportunities.
boxes, right.
Not to mention the folks who go to jail. I mean, we just recently saw another report coming out of Ferguson where even though we filed a pattern and practice, entered into a consent decree with the city because we found a pattern and practice of discriminatory behavior where the police were using ticketing in Ferguson as a revenue generator.
Yes.
Because they were targeting primarily poor people who were disproportionately black. Why? Because they knew if they had a broken taillight, they couldn't fix it. And so then what happens when you don't fix it? Well, then you get a bench warrant. And then you go to court on your bench warrant, or you don't show up because you can't leave your job, and so you miss it. And then there's a warrant for your arrest. And then what do? They pick you up and they take you to jail, and then there's bail. Well, if you couldn't fix the tailpipe, how are you going to pay your bail? Well, you can't. And so on average in our country, it's an interesting statistic. And I'm not much on data in terms of trying to convince people, but I think this will get your attention. So in the course of the year, 11 million Americans circle through our jails, which is where you go awaiting trial. Of the 11 million, they stay an average of 23 days.
Wow.
So first of all, just imagine what happens in your life in 23 days if you're a single mom or dad.
Wow.
What happens to your children? What happens to your job? Meanwhile, while those 23 days are ticking, let's say it was because you hadn't paid a fee, the interest and penalty continue to accumulate. At the end of the 23 days, only 5% are convicted and sentenced to more time than they've already served.
Wow.
Only 5%. So you have to ask yourself, do they actually belong in jail?
Awful.
If you're not going to keep them there longer than 23 days, are they a threat to society? No, you know what they are? They're poor. That's what they are. And so ending those practices, I think, are important as well. But overall, in terms of the policing communities, as I said earlier, police are simply a part of our community. And until we can start to trust one another and rely on one another, and until the police demonstrate that we should have confidence in them, and until we are able to trust them and treat them with respect. They deserve to go home safe as well, too. And until we have a system with the integrity and transparency so that people know that there's accountability. I mean, I think that if I were to sum up the need of government, most importantly, we need to know that government is accountable to us. And right now, I think there's such a breach of trust at the state, local, and federal level that there isn't that level of trust. And how do we recapture that? That's the question that we really need to pose to ourselves and demand of our leaders.
So take us through that path and bring us, if you will, to that moment, that really painful moment that everybody who's even slightly empathetic felt for you and was very upset by this crazy comment that came comparing you to a monkey.
Well, so practice, I think, is the best. Look, there are many reasons why I'm so glad I took the job in city government, obviously to meet the Obamas, but also one of the lessons that I learned in city government is that what taught me about service and about the fact that it's not about you, it's about the people you're there to serve. And the good thing about local government is that you cannot actually get away from your constituents. Right? They follow you to the grocery store, they follow you to the dry cleaners, you take your daughter to the park. They're right there 24/7. They have your phone number, they know where you live. And that's as it should be. And it was really good practice to have people come up to me all the time telling me what they thought we should be doing better for them. And one of my jobs in the mayor's office that Michelle Robinson also did when she started there is that people would show up at the mayor's office demanding to see the mayor. Well, just put yourself in that mindset. How mad do you have to be to take off work or get a babysitter, take public transit, come down to City Hall where you have no appointment and demand to see the mayor? You are really mad. You got smoke coming out of your ears. And so my job was to go out there. Obviously, I'm not the mayor, so a big disappointment just when I walk out the door. and put my arm around them and take them in my office and try to listen. The first job of service is to listen and then solve their problem. And I think those early experiences of taking heat and absorbing it and letting it, and in the book I call it absorbing pain without it making you numb or debilitating you. You've got, and that means that sometimes the criticism is totally justified and you better listen to it. And sometimes the people are just like, completely out to lunch and you don't have to listen to it, but you have to treat people with respect. And we used to kind of joke, there are people who demonstrate in front of the White House every single day. And I want to say to them, don't demonstrate in front of the White House because our offices actually face the back. And so we can't hear them, except when we're coming in and out of the gates. But I used to often want to stop and just say, the door is open. You don't have to demonstrate. I'll actually listen to you. Come inside and talk to us. And to try to change that paradigm so people don't think of government as having to be combative, but actually a partnership was what we tried to do. And so when you do that, then again, as I said earlier, it's not about you. And if it's not about you, then some tweet coming across the transom from a stranger does not hurt. It doesn't. It can't. You can't let that stuff, because it's a distraction. Another good example would be like when President Obama gave his first joint address to Congress. The topic was the Affordable Care Act. And he galvanized everybody and had the media attention talk about the Affordable Care Act. Sole topic of his speech. And what happens? Congressman Joe Wilson yells out, "You lie." And I had so many people say to me, how come he didn't stop and give Joe Wilson a piece of his mind? You know what? Because that would have been the story. He had to keep focusing on what he was there for, and that was the people's work. And so that training that I started out with early in my career and had through all the years I was in local government service, I think came in handy and armed me to be able to, you put yourself in the arena, you're going to take heat. And some of it's fair and some of it's not fair. And your job is to listen to the fair and learn to absorb the pain from the unfair.
That's amazing.
Well, plus, I got to drive through the gates of the White House every day for 8 years. I can take some heat for having had that privilege.
That's true. That's wonderful. And you've supported so many people, especially your daughter and major leaders. What's next for you? What's on your heart?
Well, no more 10-year plans, because that didn't work, right? So I will say this, and don't get mad at me, but I do wake up every single day and I do exactly what I want to do. And it is just so wonderful to do that. And having had the privilege of working really on every issue that came across President Obama's desk, both foreign and domestic, that after we finished, I thought, well, let me take a step back and say to myself, listening to the quiet voice, what are you really passionate about? What are the issues that you had a chance to dig deep and get involved in that you want to continue to work on? And it was very simple for me. I care about gender equity, so I started an organization called the United States of Women, focusing on closing that gender gap. I care about criminal justice reform, and so I work with a whole range of organizations on criminal justice reform. I care about reducing gun violence, and so I lend my voice to that issue. And I care just desperately about civic engagement. And so between When We All Vote and President Obama's foundation, which is really designed to create a platform to teach civic engagement to the next generation, that's what I want to do, serving on a few boards, and right now I'm really focused on learning how to be the best grandmother in the world.
I think that's fabulous. That's fabulous. The organization that's focused on women and gender income inequalities, I think is fabulous. It speaks to me. I'm a single mom, you're a single mom, and there's a stat that I just learned about a month ago. What would you guess the African American net worth would be?
Oh my gosh.
On
I don't
average,
know
median.
the number now, but it's a few $100s that they have in savings, right? It's
Net
not
worth.
much. Well, net worth.
All of the
biggest
assets
asset we
minus
have is our home, and we got a lot of debt.
Right.
What is it?
It's at $100.
So 100. Yeah, I knew it was in the hundreds.
So
That's what we've got.
the
$100.
median net worth for African American women. And with all of the burdens that we have, it's just unbelievable. So people focus on that 79-cent differential
Yes.
between income, but the wealth for Latina and Black people in general, but women in particular, is in the cents versus the dollar.
And it begins very young. I mean, when I was in the White House, one of my responsibilities was chairing the White House Council on
Yes.
Women and Girls, and we gave the new administration a couple of months to see if they were going to continue the council, and they didn't. And so Tina Chin, who was the executive director of it, and I chaired it all 8 years, decided, let's create a new organization, a grassroots organization based outside of government, and galvanize folks all around the country on all the issues facing women. And it's everything from our education
Yes.
to our financial literacy, to our health care, to reducing teenage pregnancy, to ensuring that we have the ability to work above the minimum wage, which is far too low in my opinion.
Far too low.
That we're getting equal pay for equal work, that we have paid leave, paid sick days, affordable childcare, affordable college education, so that at the end we can retire in dignity and lead a life where we can compete on an even playing field. And I think maybe because I have a daughter and I just want the world to be easier for her, not easy, but easier than it
Yes.
certainly is in this environment. And that basket of issues we call working family issues were important to me. And I still, and I bet you too, as a single
Yes.
mom, with everything going for me, I had health insurance, I always made reasonable salary, I always had paid leave, paid sick days, all that stuff. And I'm still handling them on my fingertips. And some of it is because I thought I was superhuman, and I could
Yes.
do everything
Yes,
myself.
Yes,
Be the perfect lawyer, the perfect mother, the perfect spouse, all of that, and doing everything that a traditional wife did, plus go to work every day. I mean, I was going to do it all. Don't do that. I was making baby food from scratch in the
I
middle of the
remember that.
night. What was I doing that? I don't know what I was thinking about. But some of it, there are these structural mechanisms that hold us back. And the good news is that employers are increasingly appreciating that as they try to compete for talent, not just to attract it, but to keep it,
Keep them. Yes.
that they're going to have to start investing in what I call this basket of working family issues.
Yes.
And those are the ones that will close that gap and give us the ability to generate some net worth so that
Yes.
we aren't so fragile and going into retirement.
That is so true.
I mean, one data point, when we were trying to get we were trying to work on college affordability. And so many young people make decisions on their career. Many of you in this room may have done the same, based on how do I pay back my college loans.
Yes.
So rather than going into public service, we're losing that treasure trove of people because they have to go out and earn enough money to pay it back. So I called the person, Barry Rand, who was the head,
Yes.
you remember
I
Barry
remember Barry,
Rand?
yeah,
So
bless his soul, R.I.P.
so he was head of AARP, which is a senior citizen organization. And I said, I know, Barry, this isn't your issue, but would you lend your support to making college more affordable? He goes, oh, no, it is my issue. You would be appalled to know the number of people who retire and become members of the AARP and they still haven't paid back their student loans.
Wow.
Imagine you are retired and you are still paying your college debt.
Wow. That's
We have to
unbelievable.
do something
we
about
have to do
that.
something about that. We really do. And it's easy for us to talk about women. I'm also very concerned about our young black boys. And
Well, now that I have a little brown grandson, I will tell you, I was looking at him the week he was born, and I can't even tell you because, as I said, every day it's something else. Something was going on in the headlines, and I thought, my goodness, what kind of a world is he coming into? What kind of a country? Forget the world.
Yes.
What kind of a country is he coming into? And I know that his parents, my daughter and her husband, are going to have to give him that talk that my cousin Mercer had from his mother when
yeah.
he was growing up, and so many of my male friends, all my black male friends. And you don't know a black male in this country whose parents have not given them that talk.
Exactly.
And when are we going to get to the point where the relationship between police and communities of color are strong? When the relationship between people are stronger.
Strong,
I mean, the
yeah.
police are simply a reflection of our community.
Totally.
And I worry that with the toxicity that we're seeing right now, obviously it's starting at the top, but permeating, that the only way that we combat that is with our voices and lift them up not in sound but in power.